The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of St. Peter's Square as security teams made their final preparations. Today would mark a historic moment in British Vatican relations, one that had been months in the planning. King Charles III and Queen Camilla were about to embark on their first official visit to Vatican City since Charles's coronation, and the weight of centuries of complex history between the British Crown and the Catholic Church hung in the air. Charles adjusted his morning coat one final time as he stood in the marble-floored reception room of their Roman hotel. The fabric felt heavier than usual, perhaps because of what this day represented. For decades, as Prince of Wales, he had dreamed of this moment, not just as a diplomatic necessity, but as a deeply personal pilgrimage. His lifelong interest in interfaith dialogue and his genuine respect for spiritual traditions had led him to this threshold of the world's smallest sovereign state. Queen Camilla stood beside him, elegant in a black ensemble that followed Vatican protocol to the letter. Her choice of attire had been carefully considered: a black dress with long sleeves, modest neckline, and a delicate black mantilla that would be worn during the papal audience. The jewelry was minimal but meaningful: a simple cross pendant that had belonged to her grandmother, and pearl earrings that caught the morning light filtering through the hotel windows. The journey to Vatican City took place in a convoy of vehicles that moved with practiced precision through Rome's ancient streets. Italian security officers on motorcycles led the way, their blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement from the previous night's rain. Behind them, the royal car, a specially armored vehicle provided by the Italian government, carried the king and queen through neighborhoods that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. As they traveled, Charles gazed out at the eternal city passing by his window. The Tiber River sparkled in the distance, and he could see ordinary Romans going about their daily lives. Mothers pushing strollers, elderly men reading newspapers at sidewalk cafes, students hurrying to classes at the university. This was the human backdrop against which diplomatic history was being made, and it grounded him in the reality that his visit was about more than ceremony. The first glimpse of St. Peter's Basilica always took visitors' breath away, but for Charles, it carried special significance. As the supreme governor of the Church of England, he was crossing into the heart of the Catholic world, a religious tradition that had shaped European history for 2 millennia. The dome, designed by Michelangelo, rose majestically against the Roman sky, its cross catching the morning sun like a beacon. Vatican security had been quietly increased for weeks leading up to this visit. Swiss guards in their colorful traditional uniforms stood at attention, their halberds gleaming, while modern security personnel in discreet suits monitored every approach to the papal apartments. The Vatican's own intelligence service had coordinated with British, Italian, and international agencies to ensure that this historic meeting would proceed without incident. The royal car passed through the bronze doors of the Apostolic Palace, entering the Vatican proper. Here, the atmosphere changed palpably. The sounds of Rome's traffic faded, replaced by the soft footsteps of clergy and the distant chiming of church bells. Ancient marble statues looked down from their niches, silent witnesses to countless moments of history that had unfolded in these corridors. Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Parolin waited in the courtyard, his scarlet robes a striking contrast against the pale stone of the palace walls. He had been instrumental in arranging this visit, working quietly with British diplomatic channels for months to ensure that every detail was perfect. The cardinal understood the delicate nature of Anglican-Catholic relations and had personally overseen the protocol that would govern every moment of the royal couple's time at the Vatican. As Charles and Camilla emerged from their vehicle, the silence was profound. No crowds cheered, no photographers jostled for position. This was a private moment, carefully shielded from public view until the formal ceremonies would begin. The king's first steps on Vatican soil were witnessed only by the small group of officials who had gathered to welcome them. The cardinal approached with the measured pace that marked all Vatican ceremonies. His greeting was formal but warm, acknowledging both the significance of the moment and the personal respect that had developed between the two institutions over recent decades. "Your Majesties," he said, his English carrying only the slightest trace of his Italian accent. "Welcome to the Vatican. His Holiness is very much looking forward to your audience." The walk through the palace corridors was a journey through art history itself. Frescoes by Renaissance masters lined the walls, their colors as vibrant as the day they were painted centuries ago. The couple's footsteps echoed softly on marble floors that had been worn smooth by countless pilgrims, diplomats, and dignitaries over the centuries. Swiss guards stood motionless at regular intervals, their presence a reminder of the unique nature of this tiny sovereign state. Charles found himself studying the artwork as they walked, his lifelong appreciation for classical beauty evident in his careful attention to the details around him. The Raphael rooms lay ahead, their famous frescoes depicting scenes from classical antiquity and Christian history. For a man who had spent his life surrounded by art and architecture, the Vatican represented the pinnacle of human creative achievement in service of faith. Queen Camilla moved with quiet dignity beside her husband, her awareness of the moment's gravity evident in her careful attention to protocol. She had studied the customs and expectations thoroughly, understanding that her behavior would be scrutinized and remembered. Her mantilla was folded carefully in her hands, ready to be worn when they entered the papal apartments. The Swiss guard captain who led their small procession had served in this role for over 20 years. He had witnessed meetings between popes and presidents, kings, and prime ministers, but he understood that today's audience carried special weight. The relationship between the British Crown and the Vatican had evolved dramatically over the centuries, from the bitter conflicts of the Reformation to the careful diplomacy of the modern era. As they climbed the marble steps toward the papal apartments, Charles reflected on the historical weight of this moment. His ancestor Henry VIII had broken with Rome in the 16th century, creating the Church of England and beginning a separation that had lasted for centuries. Now, nearly 500 years later, Charles was walking these same corridors as a guest of honor, representing a relationship that had been rebuilt through patience, understanding, and mutual respect. The papal apartments were surprisingly modest, reflecting Pope Francis's preference for simplicity over ostentation. The walls were lined with books, religious art, and simple wooden furniture that spoke to the current pope's commitment to humility. A single window looked out over St. Peter's Square, where thousands of pilgrims gathered daily to catch a glimpse of the Holy Father. Cardinal Parolin paused outside the private study where the audience would take place. Through the closed door, they could hear the soft murmur of voices as final preparations were made. The Pope's personal secretary, a gentle Italian priest who had served multiple pontiffs, was ensuring that everything was ready for this unprecedented meeting. The moments before entering the papal presence were filled with anticipation. Charles had met Pope Francis before, during the pontiff's visit to Britain years earlier, but this meeting would take place on the Pope's own territory, surrounded by the history and traditions of the Catholic Church. The significance was not lost on either of them. This was a meeting between two men who led different Christian traditions, coming together in the spirit of unity and understanding. Queen Camilla quietly placed her mantilla over her hair, the black lace falling gracefully to frame her face. The gesture was both practical and symbolic, acknowledging the sacred nature of the space they were about to enter. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the profound awareness of the historical moment they were witnessing. The cardinal knocked softly on the heavy wooden door, and a quiet voice from within invited them to enter. This was the moment that months of preparation had been building toward. The first formal meeting between the newly crowned King of England and the leader of the world's largest Christian denomination, taking place in the heart of the Catholic Church. The door opened slowly, revealing the Pope's private study bathed in warm afternoon light. Pope Francis stood near his desk, his white cassock simple and unadorned, his face bearing the gentle smile that had become his trademark around the world. The man who had chosen to be called Francis, after the saint known for his humility and care for the poor, extended his hands in welcome as the King and Queen of England stepped across the threshold into history. Behind them, the door closed softly, leaving two couples alone to begin a conversation that would echo through religious and diplomatic circles around the world. The meeting that was about to unfold would be carefully analyzed by historians, theologians, and political experts, but in this moment, it was simply four human beings coming together in a spirit of faith, hope, and mutual understanding. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows of the papal study, illuminating what would prove to be one of the most significant interfaith meetings of the 21st century. Outside in St. Peter's Square, pilgrims continued their prayers, unaware that just above them, history was quietly being written in a modest room overlooking the heart of the Catholic world. Pope Francis moved toward his visitors with the unhurried grace that characterized all his interactions. At 86 years old, the Argentine pontiff carried himself with quiet authority, his weathered hands telling the story of decades spent in service to others. The meeting that was about to unfold had been anticipated by religious leaders and diplomats around the world, but in this moment, it felt refreshingly human and immediate. "Your Majesty," the Pope said in English, his accent carrying the warmth of his South American heritage, "welcome to our home." He extended his hand first to King Charles, who took it with genuine reverence. The handshake lasted several seconds longer than diplomatic protocol required, both men recognizing the profound significance of this gesture. Behind them, Queen Camilla waited respectfully, her mantilla perfectly positioned according to Vatican custom. Charles found himself deeply moved by the Pope's presence. He had always been drawn to spiritual leaders who combined intellectual rigor with genuine compassion, and Pope Francis embodied both qualities completely. "Your Holiness," Charles replied, his voice carrying the emotion of the moment, "Camilla and I are deeply honored to be here. This has been a long-cherished hope of mine." The Pope turned to Queen Camilla with the same gentle attention. She curtsied slightly, a gesture that acknowledged both the religious significance of the meeting and her respect for the papal office. "Your Majesty," Pope Francis said, taking her hands in both of his, "you are most welcome here. I have heard much about your charitable work, particularly with literacy and domestic violence survivors." The papal study where they gathered was a testament to Francis's preference for simplicity over grandeur. Unlike the ornate reception rooms elsewhere in the Vatican, this space felt almost monastic in its restraint. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with theological texts in multiple languages, while a simple wooden crucifix hung above the Pope's desk. The only decoration was a small statue of St. Francis of Assisi, the pontiff's namesake, positioned where it could catch the afternoon light. As they settled into their chairs, comfortable but modest pieces that reflected the Pope's rejection of papal luxury, Cardinal Parolin quietly withdrew, leaving the 4 individuals alone for their private conversation. This was unprecedented. Usually, Vatican meetings included note-takers and witnesses, but Pope Francis had specifically requested complete privacy for this initial exchange. The conversation began with Charles expressing his appreciation for the Pope's environmental advocacy, a cause that had been close to the king's heart for decades. "Your Holiness," Charles said, leaning forward slightly, "your encyclical Laudato Si has been profoundly influential. The parallels between your teaching and my own environmental concerns have not gone unnoticed." Pope Francis smiled, his eyes lighting up with genuine pleasure. "Ah, yes, our common home," he replied, using the subtitle of his famous environmental letter. "You have been speaking about these issues long before they became fashionable, Your Majesty. I remember reading about your organic farming experiments decades ago, when people thought such ideas were, how do you say, eccentric?" The ice was broken, and what followed was a conversation that transcended the usual boundaries of diplomatic exchange. These were 2 men in their 70s, both carrying the weight of enormous responsibility, finding common ground in their shared concerns for humanity's future. Queen Camilla and the Pope's assistant listened as their discussion ranged from climate change to interfaith dialogue, from the role of monarchy in modern society to the challenges facing traditional religious institutions. I have often wondered, the Pope continued, how we can better serve the poor when our institutions are seen as symbols of wealth and privilege. You face the same challenge, I think, with the monarchy. His directness was refreshing, cutting through diplomatic niceties to address real questions that both men grappled with daily. Charles nodded thoughtfully. It's a constant tension, Your Holiness. How do we maintain the dignity and tradition that our roles require, while remaining relevant to people struggling with everyday challenges? I try to use my position to highlight causes that might otherwise lack a voice, but I'm always aware of the contradiction inherent in someone with my privileges speaking about poverty and injustice. Queen Camilla found herself drawn into the conversation as the Pope turned his attention to her work with domestic violence survivors. Your Majesty, he said, his voice becoming even gentler, this is sacred work you do. Too often, the Church has not been a safe place for women suffering abuse. We must do better. Her response revealed the depth of her commitment to causes that had initially surprised many observers. It's heartbreaking work, Your Holiness, but also deeply rewarding. When I see women find their voices again, rebuild their lives, it reminds me why this matters so much. The Church's support for refuge centers has been invaluable. Local priests and congregations have provided sanctuary when government resources fall short. The afternoon light gradually shifted as their conversation continued, casting different shadows across the study walls. Through the window, they could occasionally hear the sounds of St. Peter's Square, tour guides explaining the architecture, children laughing as they ran between the colonnades, the multilingual murmur of pilgrims from around the world. Pope Francis had prepared several gifts for his guests, each chosen with characteristic thoughtfulness. For King Charles, he presented a rare first edition of Cardinal Newman's Apologia Pro Vita, the 19th century work that had helped bridge Anglican Catholic understanding. The book's leather binding was worn, but well-preserved, and the Pope's inscription noted its significance. To His Majesty King Charles III, in friendship and hope for continued dialogue between our traditions. For Queen Camilla, the Pope had chosen something more personal, a small wooden cross carved by refugees in one of the Vatican's humanitarian programs. This was made by a Syrian woman who fled her homeland with her children, he explained. She carved it while staying in a church shelter in Lebanon. When I told her it would be given to the Queen of England, she wept with joy that her suffering might somehow contribute to peace. The gifts they brought for the Pope reflected equally careful consideration. Charles presented a collection of rare botanical prints from the royal collection, each depicting plants native to Argentina. I know Your Holiness maintains a small garden, Charles explained, and I thought you might enjoy seeing how botanical artists from centuries past captured the flora of your homeland. The Pope examined each print with obvious delight, pointing out plants he recognized from his youth in Buenos Aires. This one, he said, indicating a detailed illustration of a jacaranda tree, grew outside my school when I was a boy. Every spring, the purple flowers would carpet the playground. You cannot imagine how this brings back memories. Queen Camilla's gift was more contemporary, but equally meaningful. A leather-bound collection of letters from survivors of domestic violence, their identities carefully protected, sharing how faith had helped them rebuild their lives. These women wanted you to know, Your Holiness, that the Church's teaching about forgiveness doesn't mean they should remain in dangerous situations. They found ways to maintain their faith while protecting themselves and their children. The Pope read several of the letters in silence, his expression growing more serious with each account. This is important testimony, he said finally. Too often, religious leaders speak about family without understanding the reality that many families are not safe places. These women are teaching us about courage and faith in ways we need to hear. As their formal exchange of gifts concluded, the conversation turned to more personal topics. The Pope asked about their grandchildren, and Charles spoke warmly about his hopes for their future in a changing world. I worry sometimes, Charles admitted, about the world we're leaving them. Climate change, political polarization, the loss of shared values. It can feel overwhelming. Pope Francis leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. When I was chosen for this role, I was already old. Many people wondered if I had the energy for such responsibility. But I've learned that hope is not about having easy answers. Hope is about planting trees whose shade you will never enjoy, as the saying goes. Your grandchildren will face challenges we cannot imagine, but they will also have tools we never had. The private audience was scheduled to last 45 minutes, but it extended well beyond that time frame as the four individuals discovered a rapport that transcended their official roles. They discussed art, with Charles describing his watercolor painting and the Pope sharing his love for the works of Caravaggio. They talked about music, with Queen Camilla mentioning her enjoyment of both classical compositions and traditional hymns. I must confess, the Pope said with a mischievous smile, I have always been curious about your coronation ceremony. The ancient rituals, the connection to centuries of tradition, it reminds me of our own papal ceremonies, though yours are far more elaborate than anything we do here. Charles laughed, the first time he had truly relaxed since entering the Vatican. The Archbishop of Canterbury assured me that the ceremony was simplified compared to previous coronations, but I must admit it still felt quite overwhelming. The weight of history is literal when you're wearing St. Edward's crown. Their conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the study door. Cardinal Parolin had returned to remind them of the formal ceremony that would follow their private meeting. The public portion of their visit was about to begin, where cameras would record their exchange of formal greetings and official statements for history. But this private time together had already accomplished something more significant than any public ceremony could achieve. It had established genuine human connection between leaders of different Christian traditions. As they prepared to leave the intimate setting of the papal study, Pope Francis placed his hand briefly on Charles's shoulder. Your Majesty, he said quietly, I want you to know that I will pray for you and your family regularly. The burden you carry is enormous, but you do not carry it alone. The king's response revealed the depth of his spiritual commitment. Your Holiness, your prayers, and friendship mean more to me than I can express. I hope this marks the beginning of even closer cooperation between our churches in service of those who need our help most. Queen Camilla and the Pope's assistant have been quietly observing this exchange, both understanding that they were witnessing something historic. The relationship between the British Crown and the papacy had traveled an extraordinary journey from the conflicts of the Reformation to this moment of mutual respect and shared purpose. As they prepared to step back into the formal protocols of international diplomacy, all four individuals carried with them the memory of an afternoon when titles and traditions had given way to genuine human connection. The public ceremonies that would follow were important for diplomatic relations and historical record, but this private conversation had achieved something more precious. It had planted seeds of understanding that would continue to grow long after the cameras stopped recording and the diplomatic cables were filed away. Hashtag King Charles and Queen Camilla's step into the Vatican. Document 3. The transition from private conversation to public ceremony required a careful choreography that Vatican protocol masters had perfected over centuries. As Cardinal Parolin led the royal couple through corridors lined with Swiss guards, camera crews made final adjustments to their equipment in the Clementine Hall, where the formal portion of the papal audience would take place before an invited gathering of diplomats, clergy, and dignitaries. The Clementine Hall itself was a masterpiece of papal architecture, its frescoed ceiling depicting scenes from the life of Pope Clement VIII, the 16th-century pontiff who had worked to heal the religious divisions of his era. The symbolism was not lost on those who had planned this venue. Like Clement VIII before him, Pope Francis was using this space to promote reconciliation between Christian traditions that had once viewed each other with suspicion and hostility. Television crews from around the world had been positioned at strategic locations throughout the hall, their cameras ready to capture every moment of what would become one of the most watched papal audiences in recent memory. The British Broadcasting Corporation had sent their most experienced Vatican correspondent, while Catholic media outlets prepared special coverage that would be broadcast to believers across 6 continents. Among the invited guests were representatives from the Anglican Communion worldwide, Catholic bishops from England and Wales, members of the diplomatic corps accredited to both the Holy See and the United Kingdom, and leaders from various interfaith organizations. Each had received their invitation months in advance, understanding that they would be witnessing a moment of historical significance. Archbishop Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury and spiritual leader of the worldwide Anglican Communion, occupied a place of particular honor among the guests. His presence emphasized the ecclesiastical dimension of this meeting. This was not merely a diplomatic exchange between 2 sovereign entities, but an encounter between leaders of Christianity's 2 most globally influential traditions. As the formal ceremony began, Pope Francis entered the hall with a measured pace that marked all papal public appearances. His white cassock seemed to glow against the rich colors of the Renaissance frescoes, while the assembled guests rose in respectful silence. The moment carried the weight of 5 centuries of religious history, from the bitter conflicts of the Reformation to this gesture of reconciliation and mutual respect. King Charles and Queen Camilla were escorted to their positions by the Vatican's prefect of the papal household, a position that combined the roles of chief protocol officer and master of ceremonies. Every step, every gesture, every moment of eye contact was carefully choreographed to convey respect while maintaining the dignity of both institutions represented in this historic meeting. The formal speeches that followed were the product of months of careful negotiation between British and Vatican diplomatic teams. Every word had been scrutinized to ensure that nothing said would inadvertently offend either Christian tradition or compromise the theological positions that each maintained. Yet within these careful boundaries, both leaders managed to speak with genuine warmth and conviction about their shared hopes for closer cooperation. Pope Francis spoke first, his English careful and deliberate as he addressed not only his immediate audience, but the millions who would watch recordings of this moment around the world. "We gather today," he began, "not to erase the differences that exist between our Christian traditions, but to celebrate what unites us in our common love for Jesus Christ and our shared commitment to serving the poor and marginalized of our world." His speech continued with specific references to areas where Anglican and Catholic organizations had already begun working together: refugee assistance programs in Africa, educational initiatives in Asia, environmental protection efforts across multiple continents. Each example was carefully chosen to demonstrate that interfaith cooperation was not merely a diplomatic nicety, but a practical necessity in addressing the world's most pressing challenges. King Charles's response drew upon his decades of thinking about the role of faith in modern society. "Your Holiness," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustically perfect hall, "you have reminded us that Christian unity does not require theological uniformity. We can work together in service of our common humanity while respecting the traditions that have shaped our respective communities for centuries." The king's speech included a direct acknowledgement of the painful history that had separated Anglican and Catholic churches since the 16th century. "We cannot undo the wounds of the past," he said, "but we can choose to heal them through acts of mutual understanding, forgiveness, and shared service to those who need our help most urgently." Queen Camilla's role in the formal ceremony was more ceremonial, but her presence carried its own significance. As a divorced woman who had married into the royal family, she represented the kind of personal complexity that had once made Anglican Catholic rapprochement nearly impossible. Her warm reception at the Vatican demonstrated how much both institutions had evolved in their understanding of human dignity and pastoral care. The exchange of official gifts during the public ceremony differed from the personal presents shared during their private meeting. These were formal diplomatic offerings that would be preserved in both the Vatican archives and the royal collection as permanent records of this historic encounter. Pope Francis presented King Charles with a specially commissioned papal medal commemorating interfaith dialogue, while the king offered an exquisitely bound collection of Anglican theological writings dating back to the 17th century. Among the watching diplomats was the British ambassador to the Holy See, a career Foreign Office official who had spent months preparing for this moment. His cables to London over the preceding weeks had emphasized the unprecedented nature of the reception being offered to the royal couple, noting that such elaborate hospitality was typically reserved for heads of state visiting on significant anniversaries or during major international crises. The Italian government's representative in the audience understood the domestic political implications of this visit for his country. Italy's relationship with the Vatican was complex, shaped by centuries of papal temporal power, followed by the emergence of modern Italian nationalism. Hosting a visit that strengthened Vatican diplomatic ties served Italian interests by reinforcing Rome's position as a global center for interfaith dialogue. Representatives from other European monarchies watched with particular interest, recognizing that the precedent being established could influence their own relationships with the Catholic Church. The presence of the Swedish ambassador was especially notable, given that country's Lutheran heritage and the historical tensions between Protestantism and Catholicism in Scandinavian countries. As the formal ceremony continued with the traditional exchange of diplomatic pleasantries, photographers captured images that would appear on front pages around the world. The sight of the Anglican king bowing his head respectfully as Pope Francis offered a blessing represented a dramatic visual symbol of how far Christian ecumenism had progressed since the bitter divisions of the Reformation era. The papal blessing itself was carefully worded to respect Anglican sensibilities while maintaining Catholic theological integrity. Pope Francis invoked divine guidance for Charles and Camilla in their roles as monarchs, asked for God's protection of the British people, and offered prayers for peace and understanding among all Christian churches. The blessing concluded with the sign of the cross, a gesture that both Catholic and Anglican traditions shared despite their theological differences. Music played an important role in the ceremony, with the Vatican's choir performing hymns that were meaningful to both traditions. The selection included Te Deum, ancient Christian hymn that predated the Anglican-Catholic split, and How Great Thou Art, a more contemporary piece that had become beloved in both communities. The musical choices reinforced the message that Christian traditions shared far more than divided them. As the formal proceedings drew to a close, Pope Francis made an unexpected gesture that would be remembered long after the diplomatic protocols were forgotten. He approached Queen Camilla directly and spoke to her in quiet, personal terms about her work with domestic violence survivors. His words were not captured by the microphones, but observers noted the emotional impact his recognition had on the Queen, whose eyes filled with tears at the papal acknowledgement of work that had become central to her identity. The ceremony concluded with both leaders walking together toward the hall's main doors, a gesture that symbolized their willingness to move forward together despite the historical divisions that had once seemed insurmountable. Their relaxed conversation as they walked demonstrated that the personal rapport established during their private meeting had survived the formality of the public ceremony. Members of the international media immediately recognized the historical significance of what they had witnessed. Vatican correspondents with decades of experience noted that papal audiences rarely extended beyond their scheduled time limits. Yet this meeting had clearly exceeded its planned duration. The body language between the Pope and the royal couple suggested genuine warmth rather than mere diplomatic courtesy. As guests began to file out of the Clementine Hall, conversations buzzed with speculation about the long-term implications of what they had observed. Religious leaders spoke of new possibilities for theological dialogue, while diplomats assessed the potential impact on British-Vatican relations and broader European politics. Academic observers began mentally drafting articles that would analyze every gesture and word for historical significance. The Swiss guards who had stood at attention throughout the ceremony maintained their positions until the last guest departed, their colorful uniforms and ancient halberds providing a link to centuries of Vatican tradition. Yet even these guardians of papal protocol seemed to sense that they had witnessed something exceptional, a moment when past conflicts were acknowledged, but not allowed to overshadow present possibilities. In the hours that followed, Vatican press officers would field hundreds of questions from journalists seeking to understand the deeper implications of this historic meeting. The challenge would be explaining how much had been accomplished while respecting the privacy of the personal conversations that had made the public ceremony possible. The delicate balance between transparency and discretion that characterized all Vatican communications would be tested as the world sought to understand what had really transpired behind the walls of the smallest sovereign state on earth. The afternoon shadows were growing longer across St. Peter's Square as the formal portion of the royal visit approached its conclusion, but the impact of these hours would resonate through religious and diplomatic circles for years to come. History had been made not through dramatic gestures or revolutionary declarations, but through the patient work of two religious leaders choosing understanding over suspicion, cooperation over competition, and hope over the bitter memories of past conflicts. #King Charles and Queen Camilla step into the Vatican. Document for the final phase of the royal visit began with a private tour of the Vatican museums, an experience reserved for the most distinguished guests of the Holy See. Dr. Barbara Jatta, the first woman ever to serve as director of the Vatican Museums, personally guided King Charles and Queen Camilla through galleries that house humanity's greatest artistic treasures. Her expertise in art history combined with her understanding of the religious significance of each piece created a tour that was both intellectually stimulating and spiritually meaningful. Their journey through the museums began in the Gallery of Maps, where 16th-century cartographers had created detailed frescoed representations of Italian regions and papal territories. King Charles, with his lifelong interest in traditional craftsmanship, spent considerable time examining the technique used to create these geographical masterpieces. "The precision is extraordinary," he commented to Dr. Jatta, especially when you consider they were working without modern surveying equipment. Queen Camilla found herself particularly drawn to the Gallery of Tapestries, where enormous woven artworks told biblical stories with threads of gold and silver that still gleamed after centuries. Her appreciation for traditional textile arts, developed through years of supporting British craft organizations, gave her unique insight into the skill required to create these monumental works. "The faces are so expressive," she observed, studying a depiction of the Last Supper. "You can see individual emotions in each apostle." The highlight of their museum tour was always going to be the Sistine Chapel, but experiencing Michelangelo's masterpiece in complete privacy was a privilege enjoyed by very few visitors in the chapel's long history. As they entered the sacred space where papal conclaves had elected pontiffs for centuries, both Charles and Camilla stood in silent awe. The ceiling frescoes seemed to glow in the afternoon light filtering through the chapel's small windows, while the massive Last Judgment on the altar wall dominated their field of vision with its dramatic depiction of divine justice. Dr. Jatta explained the restoration work that had been completed in recent decades, revealing colors and details that had been hidden under centuries of candle smoke and grime. "When we cleaned the ceiling," she said, pointing to a particular section of the creation scenes, "we discovered that Michelangelo had used far more vibrant colors than anyone had realized. The blue of God's robes was originally this brilliant azure that takes your breath away." King Charles stood beneath the famous scene where God gives life to Adam, his head tilted back to take in the full impact of the masterpiece. As someone who had studied art history and practiced painting himself, he understood the technical achievement represented in these frescoes. "The anatomical precision is remarkable," he said quietly, "but it's the spiritual power that overwhelms you. You feel the presence of the divine in every brushstroke." The chapel's acoustic properties allowed them to experience the space as it was meant to be heard during papal ceremonies. Dr. Jatta demonstrated how the architecture carried sound, explaining how the Sistine Chapel choir's voices would fill the sacred space during important liturgical celebrations. Queen Camilla hummed a few notes of a familiar hymn, marveling at how the chapel's design enhanced and enriched the sound. Their private moments in the Sistine Chapel were interrupted by a special presentation. Pope Francis himself arrived unexpectedly, having decided to join them for a few minutes in this most sacred of Vatican spaces. His presence transformed the artistic tour into something approaching a religious pilgrimage, as the spiritual leader of over 1 billion Catholics shared his own reflections on Michelangelo's theological vision. "When I pray here during conclaves," Pope Francis said, his voice echoing softly in the empty chapel, "I am always struck by the humanity of Michelangelo's figures. These are not distant, perfect beings, but real people struggling with faith, doubt, joy, and sorrow. It reminds me that God works through human complexity, not despite it." The unexpected papal appearance in the Sistine Chapel created a logistical challenge for Vatican security, who had to quickly adjust their protective protocols. Swiss guards took new positions while modern security officers monitored the museum corridors to ensure the Pope's safety. Despite these professional concerns, the additional time spent with Pope Francis deepened the personal connection that had been established during their formal audience earlier that day. As their museum tour concluded, King Charles and Queen Camilla were invited to sign the official visitor's book in the Pinacoteca, the Vatican's picture gallery. Their signatures joined those of world leaders, Nobel Prize winners, and saints who had been honored guests of the Holy See over the decades. Charles wrote a brief message expressing his hope that their visit would strengthen the bonds of understanding between all Christians, while Camilla added her gratitude for the warmth and wisdom shared today. The final public event of their Vatican visit was a reception in the Apostolic Palace's Hall of the Consistory, where they met with senior Vatican officials, representatives of the Anglican Communion, and leaders from various interfaith organizations. This gathering was designed to showcase the broader implications of the papal royal meeting, demonstrating how improved Anglican-Catholic relations could positively impact Christian unity worldwide. Archbishop Justin Welby delivered brief remarks at the reception, noting that what we have witnessed today represents not the end of our theological differences, but the beginning of a new chapter in how we understand and express those differences. His words captured the realistic optimism that characterized the entire visit, an acknowledgement that unity did not require uniformity, and that cooperation was possible even amid continued disagreement on certain theological issues. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, prefect of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, spoke about the practical implications of improved Anglican-Catholic relations for missionary work in developing countries. In Asia, Africa, and Latin America, he explained, Christian churches often work side by side in serving the poor. When our leaders in Rome and Canterbury demonstrate mutual respect, it strengthens the hands of local clergy and lay workers who are already cooperating on the ground. The reception also featured representatives from Eastern Orthodox churches, highlighting the broader ecumenical context within which Anglican-Catholic dialogue took place. Metropolitan Hilarion of the Russian Orthodox Church, attending via video link due to travel restrictions, offered congratulations on the successful visit and expressed hope that such examples of Christian reconciliation would inspire similar progress in other interfaith relationships. As the formal events of their Vatican visit drew to a close, King Charles and Queen Camilla had one final private meeting with Pope Francis in his personal library. This brief encounter, lasting only 15 minutes, was completely off the record and without any official documentation. What transpired in that final conversation would remain known only to the 4 individuals present, but observers noted that all 4 emerged with expressions of deep satisfaction and genuine affection. The departure ceremony from Vatican City was as carefully choreographed as their arrival had been, but the atmosphere was noticeably warmer and more relaxed. Pope Francis personally escorted his guests to their waiting vehicle, a gesture of honor typically reserved for heads of state during the most significant diplomatic visits. Their handshakes at parting lasted longer than protocol required, and their final words to each other were spoken with the warmth of people who had discovered unexpected friendship. As the royal motorcade departed St. Peter's Square, crowds of tourists and pilgrims who had gathered hoped to catch a glimpse of the departing dignitaries. Many in the crowd were British visitors to Rome who had heard news reports of the historic visit and wanted to witness this moment of their country's history. Their cheers and waves provided a spontaneous popular endorsement of the diplomatic breakthrough they had observed. The drive back through Rome took the royal couple past many of the ancient sites that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and growth of Christianity, and countless moments of historical significance. As they passed the Colosseum and the Forum, both Charles and Camilla reflected on how their day at the Vatican had added another chapter to the long story of this eternal city. Italian media coverage of the visit was universally positive, with major newspapers praising both the Vatican's hospitality and the British royals' respectful engagement with Catholic tradition. La Gazzetta dello Sport noted the historic nature of the visit, while emphasizing how it reinforced Rome's position as a global center for diplomatic and religious dialogue. Vatican Radio began special programming that would analyze the visit's significance for Christian unity worldwide. Back in Britain, initial reactions to news reports of the successful Vatican visit were overwhelmingly favorable across the political spectrum. Members of Parliament from both major parties praised the King's diplomatic skills and the positive representation of British values on the international stage. Even traditionally anti-monarchist publications acknowledged that Charles had conducted himself with dignity and had advanced important interfaith dialogue through his Vatican engagement. The Archbishop of Canterbury issued a formal statement upon the royal couple's departure from Vatican City, describing the visit as a remarkable demonstration of how Christian leaders can transcend historical divisions to work together for the common good. His words were carefully chosen to reassure Anglican evangelicals who might be concerned about any compromise of Protestant principles while celebrating the breakthrough in Catholic relations. In the weeks that followed their Vatican visit, King Charles and Queen Camilla would carry the memory of their time with Pope Francis into their other royal duties and charitable work. The personal connection they had established with the Holy Father would influence their approach to interfaith initiatives, environmental advocacy, and social justice causes for years to come. More immediately, their successful navigation of this complex diplomatic challenge enhanced their credibility as representatives of modern Britain on the world stage. The Vatican's own assessment of the visit, shared discreetly with papal nuncios around the world, emphasized how the personal chemistry between Pope Francis and King Charles had exceeded all diplomatic expectations. The Holy See's diplomatic corps was instructed to look for opportunities to build upon the momentum created by this successful encounter, particularly in areas where Anglican and Catholic organizations could collaborate on humanitarian initiatives. As evening fell over the Eternal City, the papal apartments returned to their normal quiet routine. Pope Francis spent time in private prayer, reflecting on the day's events and considering how the relationships established during the royal visit might be nurtured and developed in the months and years ahead. The seeds of understanding planted during these historic hours would require careful cultivation, but the potential harvest promised to benefit not only Anglican-Catholic relations, but the broader cause of Christian unity worldwide. The formal documents recording this papal audience would eventually take their place in the Vatican's secret archives, alongside the records of countless other diplomatic encounters throughout church history. But the true significance of King Charles and Queen Camilla's step into the Vatican would be measured not in archive protocols, but in the practical cooperation and genuine friendship that grew from their courageous decision to bridge centuries of religious division through personal encounter and mutual respect.